stepping away from the bike positioning stuff, which I obviously do all day, every day these days.
But you are a sports physiotherapist first.
I am a sports physio. I should qualify this with a lot of the stuff I'm about to tell you is outside of my area of knowledge in detail. I'm not a biologist. You basically, to go into a deep dive on this, and we'll put some links in the description, if you are a quantum physicist, a biophysicist, or a really, really, highly accredited metabolic kind of researcher, a lot of this will make sense. So I'm going to try and keep this really simple, but this is outside of my area of expertise. But it is fascinating and it's well worth thinking about. And if you're really interested, do a deep dive on these subjects that I'm going to tell you about, because I find this stuff fascinating. So this is stuff that people have kind of introduced me to as we're waffling on about their position, fixing their position in my clinic. We talk about all sorts of stuff with some pretty high-level athletes. So we'll hopefully have a few more of these as we go, but today's one is about light. So we're going to talk about two things. The first one is a little bit easier to understand. The second one is very complex, and I'm not sure I understand it perfectly well myself. Circadian rhythms. Now, circadian rhythms are your sleep cycles and your awake cycles, right? So your human body has a number of timing mechanisms which regulate circadian rhythms. We all know that sleep is one of the primary determinants of cardiovascular performance. I've seen research studies where they have taken sleep-deprived athletes who've been deprived to the tune of about 3 or 4 hours of sleep for 2 nights, and they've done a VO2 max test on them, which is between 15 and 30% worse than it would be if they were not sleep deprived. So sleep deprivation is pretty bad for your cardiovascular performance.
Yeah. Which you would say is very common with recreational and amateur road cyclists, because a lot of them get up early to train and some might be going to bed late as well. So it's like a double-edged sword.
What I would say is it's common with modern humans.
Okay.
Yeah, not everyone, but look, dysregulation of the circadian rhythms is a really common thing in our society. And the reason why is mostly light and the lifestyles that we live. So the way
you say light, are you talking about sunlight?
All types of light. Some of them dysregulate your circadian rhythms and some of them regulate your circadian rhythms. We basically have in the back of our retinas a bunch of specialized neurons which convey information back to our brain and our vagus nerve and all the other neurological systems in your body which regulate your sleep cycles. Essentially what happens is, and this is really keeping it very simple, when humans have evolved that as the sun comes up, we would often, usually, almost always, with the absence of blue light from our surroundings and lights and work and all these other things, if you were living in a hunter-gatherer type situation, you would wake almost always as the sun rises. You would get a lot of what we call red-shifted light. So as the light comes through the low angles of the upper troposphere, everything else bounces off and you get a lot of red light coming through. Turns out that these specialized receptors in the back of your eyeball sense that, and they use that to know that it's sunup. So your brain has a very, very accurate internal clock, which is, and this is one of the things that the clock measures, is basically sunrise. The other thing it measures is sunset. So in the late evening, the same thing happens as the sun goes down over the horizon. You get a lot of red-shifted light. These two red-shifted light periods of the day are what our nervous system uses, one of the mechanisms that it uses to time your circadian rhythms and your sleep cycles. So let's say you have a job where you're on call, or you're working shift work, and you work in the middle of the night. You're asleep during the day. Your circadian rhythms are backwards, and you never see the sunrise and you never see the sunset, and you're always in artificial bright white light, which has got a lot of blue wavelengths in it. Essentially, your brain thinks that it's always the middle of the day. So when you're only ever in artificial light, this system gets really messed up. And it basically, you get a lot less proper deep REM sleep, a lot less cold cycling through your sleep cycles with core temperature and so forth, and it stuffs up your rest, which means you perform worse. So what we're interested in is obviously performance, and we all know that sleep is a really important thing for performance. This dysregulates your sleep. So what do you do about it? Well, if it's possible to do so, try and see the sun up and try and see the sun down. in your life if you can. And after dark in particular, don't look at screens, because screens are lots of blue light. And if you have to look at screens for your job or your work, try and turn the filter on, right? The red light filter, so that the screen shifts really red, so that you're not getting signals going to your cerebellum and your brain, basically, that it's the middle of the day, with all that blue light, because it dysregulates your sleep cycles. So if you wake up early in the morning, watch the sun up, eat your breakfast out on your front porch instead of in your kitchen. Make some changes to your life so that you can see the sun come up. I don't mean staring at the sun. What I mean is being outside, watching the sun rise and getting a lot of that red shifted light, 20 or 30 minutes if possible, and then watch the sunset, and don't have sunglasses on. As crazy as it sounds, this will just won't work at all if you're wearing, polarized sunglasses. So this is a really big thing with sleep regulation, which then impacts performance. Second thing about sunlight, and this is where it gets tricky, and this is outside of my area, and I really don't understand this very well, but I've looked into the papers around this, and this is legitimate. Your mitochondria, a lot of us would have heard about mitochondria. Mitochondria are the engine room of our bodies, basically.
The powerhouse to the cell.
Powerhouse of the cell. They generate, store, and transport energy around our body, right? Mitochondria they run on ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is a special molecule, which is basically, think of it as petrol for the engine, right? Everything kind of runs on ATP.
Zone 2 training is very good for mitochondrial health, isn't it?
We'll plug Zone 2 training.
Yeah.
Might as well. ATP is made by a thing called ATP synthase. Now, which is a pretty, they call it ATPase or ATP synthase. It synthesizes ATP. How does ATP synthase work? ATP synthase is a quantum nanorotor engine. Basically, what we're dealing with here is at the electron scale, the atomic scale, there is a head of the ATP synthase molecule which spins around, I think it's around 300 times a second it spins, and it shuttles protons through it.
You're going deep here, Neil.
This is really deep. This is like quantum mechanics.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, mate, you can go and look at animations of this and try and nut it out, but it's complex stuff.
Yeah.
I don't really understand it very well.
You sound like you do.
I'm making it sound like I do. But essentially, this is an electron chain transport mechanism by which we make ATP.
Yep.
We make fuel from electrons. The electrons come from one of two sources, as it turns out. One of them is food. This is the obvious one. Carbohydrates in particular, but basically glucose, right? So we can create ATP from food. There is a second mechanism, which is, I think this stuff has only been found in the last 2 or 3 years. It turns out that ATP synthase has a UV detector on it in the mitochondrial cell wall. What that means is that when vitamin D is circulating around in your body, when you're out in the sun, the electron chain transport from glucose stops, and the ATP synthase runs on red light from the sun. So the dominant emission spectrum from the sun is hydrogen. 50 to 60% of the fusion going on in the sun is hydrogen fusion, and it's mainly red shifted light. So this is crazy, but what this kind of means is, and the research on this is very, very clear. You can create energy from the sun, which sounds bizarre when you just say it without a lot of background, but this is what plants do, right? They create energy from the sun. Turns out that we have this ability as well. And this is a second part of our metabolism, which not many people kind of know about. I had no idea until a month ago when I listened to a podcast from a physicist about this, and I thought, that can't be right. And I started researching it. Turns out the guy's right. And you can create energy from the sun. Think of it in really simplistic terms as your body is kind of a battery. You can store electrons from multiple sources, right? And one of them happens to be the sun. Red light penetrates between 6 and 10 centimeters through human tissue. So it goes deep into you, and your ATP can run on red light. Your ATP synthase, can run on red light. So this sounds crazy. We can potentially deep dive on this. I would recommend the Huberman Lab podcast if you want to look into these subjects. There was one in April 2022 all about circadian rhythms. It's brilliant. And Jack Kruse, Kruse, Jack Kruse he's a neuroscientist. He did a fantastic 7-hour-long 2-part podcast with Rick Rubin and Andrew Huberman. We'll put a link to that as well. It's deep stuff. Quantum physics, this stuff is tricky to understand. And I've listened to it 5 times and I still get about a quarter of it, right? But essentially the research on this is good. So what this means is when you're out in the sun a lot, you don't have to eat as much, because you can generate energy from the sun at some level. So we often get taught, hey, the sun is bad. Don't go in the sun. You'll get skin cancer. That may not be entirely true. And I have been exploring this myself. You may notice my tan is slightly deeper than it usually is.
Yeah.
I've made a massive effort to get out in the sun, and I'm talking like mostly full body contact, so just without my shirt on, in the sun, particularly early morning when you're not going to get burnt, for 60 to 90 minutes, as much as I possibly can all the time. And my appetite has dropped a lot.
Wow.
A lot. I'm eating less than I ever have, but my energy levels are way more stable.
Is that good for an ectomorph though?
Turns out it is, because
Okay.
I'm also putting on mass at the same time.
Okay.
So this is all sort of stuff I've only experimented with in the last month. But if you want a deep dive on this, have a look at those 2 resources, which we'll link to in the description, because they are fascinating.
Right.
When you're a super nerd like me, they're fascinating. Anyway.
Yes.
But essentially, light and skin contact from redshifted light, which is particularly early morning light, may actually be very, very good for your metabolism. So
Right.
something to think about.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you sleep.
And your sleep, yes, which
Yes.
is the first part of the
Yes.
light sort of story for athletic performance. And there is a lot more to it. And if you're into this sort of stuff, listen to a couple of Jack Kruse's podcasts, because they are fascinating.
Yep.
So there you go.
Thanks, mate.
That is an interesting biohack.
That was a deep
one.
dive.
Yeah, well, we touched it, but
Yeah.
there's like this much more if you
Yeah.
really want to get into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.